Ms. Kristin Beykerley, Deputy Regional Director for MENA at Amnesty International. Hello and welcome to An-Nahar. We'd like to discuss today the latest report on the extensive Israeli destruction in southern Lebanon. The report, Nowhere to Return, documents how more than 10,000 civilian structures and properties were actually destroyed in southern Lebanon across 24 municipalities between October 2024 and January 2025. To start with, Lebanon has not ratified the Rome Statute. How does this affect the possibility of prosecuting Israel for committing war crimes?
So first of all, thank you so much for organizing this discussion. Lebanon's failure to ratify the Rome Statute, the founding treaty of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, means that the ICC cannot investigate nor ultimately prosecute those who are responsible for international crimes committed on Lebanese territory. Why does that matter? There are international crimes being committed on Lebanese territory. And instead of joining most countries in the world that have ratified the Rome Statute, the Lebanese government has been dilly-dallying. The International Criminal Court is the world's only international criminal court. It has the power, when it is granted jurisdiction, to investigate international crimes, including war crimes, and to prosecute those responsible for the most serious crimes. It's actively investigating international crimes in a bunch of different places all over the world, from Afghanistan to Myanmar. Now, we know that if Lebanon were to grant the court jurisdiction, the court would then have the ability to look into what has happened in Lebanon, and where it finds sufficient evidence of international crimes, take prosecutions forward. But that's really in the hands of the government of Lebanon, so failing to do so is signaling to people, A, that they're not taking international law seriously enough, and B, that they're not doing everything they can to uphold victims of international crimes' right to justice.
The report concludes that the Israeli acts amount to war crimes. What are the amnesty's next steps? And if those responsible were not actually held accountable, what message does this send to the world? And does it signal a gradual erosion in the international humanitarian law?
So I think we know for sure that impunity, or the absence of accountability, as well as double standards, so when international law is applied in one way in one place, but in a different way in another place or not applied at all, that erodes trust in international law and in the international legal system. I will say, as a person who has been involved in human rights for a long time, I have had my moments of despair over the last 2 years, but even longer than that.
Yeah.
What I will say, though, is that's one of the reasons why I'm glad Amnesty is not just an organization, it's also a movement. So in addition to writing reports, we have 10 million members worldwide. And so when we write a report, we don't do it just to put the facts out there and provide a legal analysis, in this case calling for investigations into war crimes, but because what we hope is that Amnesty's 10 million members, as well as all of the other people all over the world who do really care about human rights and do really care when international crimes are committed, will take the report and use it to bring about change. And when I say bring about change, I mean a number of different things. That could be writing letters, it could be joining protests. In Lebanon, it could be calling on the government of Lebanon to join the ICC or demand reparation. Outside of Lebanon, it could be, if you're a person, for example, who lives in the United States of America, calling on your government to stop selling weapons. Same for a number of European countries. So the hope for us, and what we do with all of our reports, including this one, is we then say, okay, we have the findings, we have the legal analysis, now what can all of us do to try and push for a world where it's slightly more possible, where we can imagine seeing some form of accountability and repair?
Yeah, hopefully. The report calls for Israel to provide full compensation to victims and for a halt in arms transfers. How realistic is achieving this? And is there actually a genuine international will to support these demands?
I think it's a totally fair question.
Yeah.
I have a sense of what you might think. Here's what I'll say, is almost always, or pretty regularly, when whoever is committing the international crimes, there's often a focus on what we've been talking about. So criminal prosecutions, going to the ICC, and that is super important. But sometimes people forget that there's also a very clear obligation for the state that commits international humanitarian law violations to provide reparation. And in this context, that's Israel, which has committed serious international humanitarian law violations. Now, what you're asking me is not, is there an obligation? You're asking me, is it realistic that Israel actually will provide those reparations?
Absolutely.
And I think the answer is obviously no, right? We know that. Even before this war, there have been demands on Israel to provide reparation for stuff that happened in 2006, and people still haven't received reparation for that. That said, just because Israel is not likely to provide reparation anytime soon, that's not the same thing as saying there's nothing that the government of Lebanon can do or that the rest of us can do to at least demand that those rights are upheld and try and make it a little bit more likely. So I'll give you some concrete examples. Lebanon could invite, there's a specific UN expert who focuses on truth, justice, and reparation. Lebanon could invite that expert to come to Lebanon and say, hey, let's look at what happened during the war. Lebanon could create a reparation mechanism domestically. Lebanon could go to the UN and say, hey, we want to commission studies into the losses that people studied during the war so that we at least know how much people are owed. And this isn't all kind of make-believe stuff. After Russia invaded Ukraine, for example, a bunch of states came together at the UN General Assembly and they issued a resolution saying that Russia owed Ukraine and people in Ukraine reparation for violations that had happened during the war. After that, a bunch of states came together and specifically made an international registry focused on compensation for people in Ukraine. Are the politics different for Lebanon and Israel and Ukraine and Russia? Absolutely. Does that mean we shouldn't call for reparation for people in Lebanon who have had their rights violated? Absolutely not. So I think one thing that we're trying to contribute with this report is to say, we don't get closer to it becoming realistic by doing nothing. We get closer by saying this is what is owed, and now these are the various things that we can all try in the meantime to try and make it seem more possible.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Most of the destruction actually happened after the ceasefire, after the 27th of November, and it affected civilian homes and properties. How do you assess these acts under the international humanitarian law?
Sure. So I think the first thing to say is we're sitting in Beirut right now, and I think anybody who's in Lebanon knows that while there was a ceasefire, there has not been a ceasing of fire since 27th November.
Really.
So one of the things that we wanted to do in this report was look at very specifically a particular type of destruction and damage that was happening along the southern border. And by that I mean, under international law, there's different standards for when damage or destruction happens in the context of an attack or sort of during active fighting and outside the context of an attack. So what we did for this report is we said, let's look at damage and destruction in southern Lebanon. And what we found pretty quickly when we were doing that research was that so much of that was happening outside the context of an attack. And one way you can look at that, for example, is when Israel was in control of the area when they were doing the damage and destruction, or the method of the damage and destruction. So for example, in the report, one thing that we really focus on is Israel doing manual demolitions of buildings or bulldozing land.
True.
And in addition to that, we also look at the time when the damage and destruction was carried out, including much of it happening after the ceasefire. Some of it also happened before the ceasefire. So in terms of our analysis, what that means is under international humanitarian law, you say, okay, if a warring party, in this case Israel, is damaging and destroying civilian property outside the context of an attack, what international law says is they can only do so when they have what's known as imperative military necessity. And this is a really high standard. So what we said was, okay, well, what does Israel say it's doing? Why is Israel claiming that it's destroying all of these things? And there's different justifications that they've used. They've said, well, this building used to have Hezbollah fighters, or there were tunnels, or maybe we want to create a buffer zone, or we have the right to security. And if you look at what international law says, none of these reasons equals imperative military necessity. And to put that more simply, you don't get to destroy people's homes because of a future hypothetical threat that you are saying exists. And so ultimately, when you look at all of the damage and destruction that happened outside the context of military attacks in southern Lebanon over this 4-month period, including 2 months after the ceasefire, what you see is, first of all, very clear, serious international humanitarian law violations. And wherever Israel did that intentionally or recklessly, that's a war crime. And that's kind of what we tried to say in the report, is that we're looking at this huge swath of damage and destruction, this kind of trail of destruction all along the borders. And we're also looking at specific villages that had more than 70% of their structures damaged and destroyed. And we're saying, okay, was this justified under international law? Doesn't seem like it. What needs to happen next? And in the context of apparent war crimes, that's super obvious, which is investigations and accountability and reparation, which we've been talking about.
To conclude, families returning to southern Lebanon find everything destroyed. In your conversations with survivors, which emotions are most prominent? Fear, loss, anger, resilience?
Yeah.
I would say that in the conversations our team has had with people have had very different reactions. So for some, kind of the loss and the grieving is most prominent. For some, anger is most prominent. For some, kind of trying to pick up the pieces is most prominent. It really depends, and I think that's super normal. The two things that I would say struck me the most in terms of what people talk to us about in terms of their sort of experience of this loss, I think number one is that our researchers looked at all of these videos and photos that were posted online, and they verified when they were taken, where they were taken by Israeli soldiers, kind of destroying things, sometimes celebrating them. And our researchers were doing that to document and analyze under international law what they were seeing. But then you talk to people from these villages who are watching the same videos, and like sometimes watching their house being destroyed and watching Israeli soldiers celebrate when their house is being destroyed. And I think that really stuck with me, because one person in particular said that she watched the video of her house being blown up every day. And I think that's part of the reason we go on and on and on about accountability, because accountability, when it comes down to it, is just about saying, what happened to you is not right, and there's a whole bunch of people who are coming together and saying that this is not okay. But I think the other thing that really struck me from conversations with people who had homes, property, land destroyed was that repeatedly people made the point that these places are not just the physical structures, right? They're like the places that hold their memories. They're where they played as kids. They're where they said goodbye to their grandparents. And I think one of the women who spoke with us put it this way: the land and the trees and the home reminded her of her great-grandparents and her grandparents. And the way she put it was, losing a home is like losing the family member all over again. And I think, I think that resonates for anybody who sort of has a place that they love and brought them joy and kind of connected them either to family or community, to then go back and not even be able to recognize the place because the destruction is so massive.
Very sad, very true. I personally appreciate all the efforts you've done and still do to shed light on these matters. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your insights with النهار. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.